Well, to discuss this, let's go to our panel in Seoul. I'm joined by BJ Kim. He's a professor of foreign studies at Hankuk University. Se-Woong Koo is the co-founder and publisher of Korea Expose, an online magazine specializing in Korean politics, culture and society. And Neil George is an English filmmaker and professor who's lived in South Korea for 8 years. He's produced documentaries looking at Korean society. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. BJ Kim, let me start with you. Those protesters calling those Yemeni refugees fake refugees, what's behind that? Why are they saying that?
Well, basically the legal process, the legal system that's designed to protect them is the one that's there to protect the political refugees. And so those people who are not happy about the inflow of these Yemenis refugees in the country are making a legal argument here. They're saying they're not qualified for them, for the system itself. And that's their way of kind of resisting this inflow. And actually what happened was about from the end of 2017, 484 or so Yemenis have applied for refugee status, political refugee status. And so far, only 2 of them were fully qualified. And most of them, the rest of them, were allowed to stay in Korea, but they were not given the refugee status. So whatever the opposition was making argument, I think the argument kind of worked in that sense, with the fact that not such a small number of refugee status was offered. So in that sense, I guess their legal argument kind of made a difference, right, the way I see it.
So, Se-Woong Koo, you don't have to work too hard by looking at international news to know that there's a terrible war raging in Yemen. 10,000 people have been killed. Hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced. There's starvation, there's cholera, there's all sorts of stuff. So why isn't that enough for the South Korean people to at least give these people the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, we might give you a chance?
Well, there are a number of reasons, but one that has been mentioned very often here in South Korea is the fact that many of the Yemenis who came to South Korea were in fact men. And there was this idea that somehow men are the ones who should be able to stay in their countries and defend it and not run away from warfare. This view is partly informed by the fact that even South Korea itself has been kind of in a technical state of war for some time. And there's an understanding that it is the duty of you as a subject of the nation state to actually defend it. But they were arguing that these Yemeni men who came to South Korea, in fact, abnegated that responsibility. There was also argument that, in fact, many of these refugees are economic migrants looking for employment overseas, and that they were actually coming to Jeju in order to work and make money, and they were not, in fact, in any danger. This is the kind of story that we have seen from Korean media last summer.
Neil George, as the outsider on the panel, living within the country, I'm going to ask you the simple, crass question. Is it a xenophobic country?
To some extent, you could argue that it has a very limited amount of multiculturalism within the country. But, I mean, historically, Korea has used foreign aid and has used foreign money to develop itself. So then racism is quite deeply rooted in the country. It's a very conservative and liberal mix when it comes to dealing with politics in the country here. So the way that the people reacted, I wasn't surprised to the way they reacted to the Yemeni asylum seekers when they came in. But I was a little disappointed, to be honest. But when we see and we think about the amount that's happened since the 2016 candlelight protests and the solidarity that was shown through Korean society, the people coming together to bring down the president at the time, it was a little disappointing to see the action that they couldn't kind of come to a better understanding of what was happening in Yemen. They didn't seem that interested in understanding the stories from the refugees. There was very limited amount of information that came out of the news media, local news media. So it was a big cycle that continued and still continuing to today, actually.
Right.
That I've been working on some films, trying to raise their voices. But even today, the young South Koreans still don't really have a full grasp or full understanding of what is actually happening in Yemen.
Is there an assumption, Se-Woong Koo, that because South Korea is not North Korea, therefore by default it's automatically open, it's automatically cosmopolitan, it's automatically all those things that the brethren in the North are not? And is that maybe also a stereotype that we need to address as the international community from the outside?
Well, certainly there seems to be that perception of South Korea, as you said, as a developed country, one that has freedom, is a country that even overthrew a president quite recently. That said, in fact, there's a reason that many refugees actually made their way to South Korea. It's the fact that certainly this country subscribes to international norms. It has signed the treaties, UN conventions that call for protection of refugees. And those are the reasons that people were drawn here in the first place, because in fact for the Yemenis, there weren't that many choices in the region. But after they came, they clearly found out that despite these technical ratifications, South Korea, in fact, is not a country that abides by these international norms. And that's what's been so troubling, not just for them, for many other refugees and migrants that I have spoken to over the last several months. They say discrimination is pervasive, and they have had real difficulty in adjusting. And as one of your other commentators said earlier, very few of them have been given refugee status, and the South Korean government has tried to make do by giving them what it calls a humanitarian status, which grants them a limited time of residency and work permit, but without any kind of benefits that would be they would be entitled to should they be actually recognized as refugees.
BJ Kim, are we being a bit too harsh on the South Korean government when we look at the fact that it did join the 163 UN member states in signing that non-binding resolution in Marrakesh, where it committed to helping migration, being a part of the solution, being more open? Are we being harsh because the intentions are there to be more open?
I guess you can say that because Korea was the first East Asian country having done so. And so that's a major, major step before Japan or any other so-called relatively more advanced countries in East Asia. Korea was the first one that made a move, and probably the only one so far as I know. And so Korean governments have had, different governments in Korea have shown such a willingness for being more open and become more cosmopolitan in this country. And we have to keep in mind, the visible voice, the audible voice and visible images that we see in terms of protest against the Yemenis refugees. This is the voice of the people, less than half of the population. The country is divided, of course, and the other half or more than half of the population, I don't think we can say they're xenophobic, and there have been much criticism against these people who are arguing against the inflow of refugees. So country itself, we have a long way to go still in terms of unifying the country to have more the perspective of cosmopolitan views here in this country. But we have growing number of people who recognize the need for Korea to be more open and very different from other East Asian countries. So I think the Yemenis case made an important difference in the country in terms of advancing the thinking among the people here and giving a new realization about which new direction the country should take going forward.
Yeah, and we are having this conversation on international news, so I guess it is advancing the thinking and the conversation. Se-Woong Koo, is there a balancing act to be played out here when we look at, low birth rates, economically long-term planning? The government clearly sees that, they might need migrants, but on the other hand, you have a big chunk of the population that's not as warm or open to outsiders as maybe some other countries, and they have to play this balancing game.
Yes, there is certainly a need to accommodate more foreigners here, no question, because of the population decline that you have mentioned, because of the unwillingness of the local population to perform certain tasks. That said, the attitude, unfortunately, on the part of the local population has not been welcoming. I'm afraid that I have to disagree with the previous commentator that the opinions are divided half and half. In fact, we had 700,000 people signing the petition calling on the government to turn away these refugees, and that was a record number. We've also seen various surveys showing that most South Koreans are actually opposed to refugees. That is more than half. This is not a 50-50 situation. We also have a very troubling situation here where foreigners, when they're welcomed into Korea, they're assigned to particular categories and they are subject to systemic discrimination. We have a migrant population of migrant workers, estimated to be about 270,000, many of whom speak about really difficult conditions that they experience at work. sometimes not even protection according to the standards that are established by Korean labor acts.
Right.
We have foreign women who are coming here and marrying foreign women coming here and marrying Korean men. And they too talk about systemic discrimination and the intense pressure they experience in having to assimilate to Korean culture and to really become Korean in order to be accepted as any kind of viable member of society. So that is the troubling situation that Korea needs to recognize.
You brought up something interesting because you spoke about particular categories, and I want to ask Neil George, are some foreigners more equal than others? And is the trick in this conversation the mere fact that these are Yemeni citizens? Might they have been treated differently if they were, I don't know, Bosnian refugees, Norwegian refugees, whatever? Throw up any hypothetical you want. Is there something special about them being Yemeni that really ticked people off?
In terms of them being from Yemeni, they obviously have a Muslim Islamic background, and South Korea has very, very limited information and knowledge about Muslim and Islam in general. So they didn't really take into account their stories. They didn't listen so much to any of the stories that the Yemeni refugees were trying to say. The government effectively controlled what news was being allowed to come out. The Yemenis were scared as well because they hadn't even got any kind of status for around 6 months. They didn't find out exactly what was going to happen for 6 months. They couldn't work. They didn't want to raise their voice. They didn't want to complain because they're stuck in no man's land effectively. So it was an incredibly difficult situation for them. And at the time, all they're seeing in the media is incredibly negative points. Everything anti-Muslim, everything against them wanting to come out, the petition that was signed that Se-Woong mentioned. So everything was against them. And so it was an incredibly difficult time within the country. And we also have to remember that most of the protesting was actually taking place on the mainland, not in Jeju.
Right.
So this shows the mentality of the Korean people, that they're kind of this protesting trend that they've been going through for a long time. When they don't like something, they want to complain about it, they take to the streets in protest.
Okay, that's a good point. And I want to get a response from BJ Kim. BJ Kim, in addition to your response, fold in your response to this, because our reporter found with the Koryo Saram, the ethnic Koreans who had grown up in places like Russia coming back, finding it difficult to be accepted, right? Because of language difficulties and beyond, and just the mere fact that they or their parents grew up in places like Russia. What does that say about South Korea's dealing with those they consider outsiders, even those who are ethnic Koreans?
Well, this is, of course, I mean, you know, in a way, I agree with the other two speakers that about the argument that Korea has a long way to go in terms of making this country more open. You know, we have many problems, many challenges ahead. And as you said, you know, the ethnic Koreans who do not speak Korean language, they do face challenges here. But what I'm saying here is, in comparison with other East Asian countries, Korea is making conscious efforts. The host has made a point about what Korean government has done in terms of introducing this international standard into our system. This is the first country doing so, as I said, in this region. So we are making the efforts. And when the other two guests are saying that this country is mostly closed and almost everyone in this country is xenophobic, that's grossly overstatement. This is a very much of an exaggeration in a very negative way. The way I see it, the glass is half empty and half full. Of course, we have to fill up the glass. There is no question about it. And we hear a lot of voices asking for the need of making, you know, such movement towards that direction. As I said before, you see these people protesting on the street, you see their voices and so on. That's because they're visible and they're audible. But there is considerable size of people here in Korea who see the need to open this country to the refugees, remembering that Koreans ourselves have been refugees during the time of Korean War. So, you know, I cannot agree with the notion that most of the Koreans are all xenophobic. That's not the case.
Okay, well, it's been important to have this conversation. It's not often that we talk about South Korea and migrants and refugees on the Newsmakers. And I'm very happy that we have, and hopefully it's the first of many to come. BJ Kim, Se-Woong Koo, and Neil George, I'm out of time. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers.